Have you ever discovered that something you believed for years was wrong, and yet you continue to believe it anyway? Not because there was a lack of evidence. Not because no one ever showed you otherwise. But because, somehow, abandoning that idea seemed too difficult. Too uncomfortable. Perhaps even threatening. If this has ever happened to you, and the chances are very high that it has, stay with me until the end because what you're about to discover might surprise you. There is something profoundly curious, and even unsettling, about how the human brain works. We like to believe that we are rational, logical, guided by facts and evidence. We like to think that, when faced with a disproven idea, we simply look at the data, accept the correction and move on. But the reality is quite different. In practice, the brain doesn't function like an impartial judge in search of truth. It functions much more like a defense attorney, trying to protect what it already believes in. And that's exactly why ideas that have already been debunked continue to live on for so long. Even when they are refuted by science. Even when we already know they don't make sense. Even when, deep down, some part of us senses that something is wrong. The brain clings. It insists. It resists. And no, this is not a sign of stupidity, ignorance, or stubbornness. This is pure and simple brain function. Have you ever experienced this? That strange feeling of hearing new, correct, well-explained information, and yet feeling an internal, almost automatic discomfort? As if something inside you were saying, I don't know, this doesn't seem right. This discomfort doesn't stem from logic. It stems from emotion, memory, identity. Because many of the ideas we carry aren't just loose thoughts, they become part of who we are. From a very early age, the brain learns to create mental shortcuts. It constructs quick explanations to understand the world, save energy, and maintain a sense of security. When an idea takes hold early, especially if it has been repeated many times, it becomes a kind of internal truth. An anchor. Questioning it later is not just reviewing information. It's tampering with something that has become familiar, comfortable, predictable. And the brain loves comfort. It loves predictability. It loves the feeling of, I already know how this works. That's why, when faced with a disproven idea, the brain doesn't react with curiosity, but with defense. It feels threatened. After all, if that idea was wrong, what else could be? What if I'm wrong about other things too? This doubt is uncomfortable. And the brain does everything to avoid it. Perhaps you've already noticed this in discussions, debates, or even simple everyday conversations. The more someone tries to correct an old belief, the more the other person seems to shut down. The more evidence appears, the more arguments emerge to defend the original idea. This happens because the brain isn't trying to understand better, it's trying to preserve internal coherence. It prefers to stick with a known explanation rather than face the feeling of uncertainty. And here's the most intriguing point. Often, the brain prefers a wrong but familiar idea to a new truth that generates discomfort. It confuses familiarity with truth. It confuses repetition with validity. You confuse emotional security with being right. And all this happens silently, automatically, without us realizing it. If you think this only happens to other people, beware. This is one of the brain's most sophisticated tricks. We are all subject to this mechanism. We all carry ideas that have already been disproven, not for lack of information but because abandoning them requires more than logic. It requires cognitive courage. And this is exactly where the story starts to get even more interesting. Because understanding why the brain clings to ideas that have already been disproven completely changes the way you see your own beliefs, your certainties, and even your deepest convictions. What follows will reveal layers of this functioning that almost no one notices, but that influence your decisions every day. And perhaps, as you listen to all this, some memory has already surfaced within you. A situation, a conversation, an old belief that now makes you think, how did I take so long to question this? If this topic resonates with you, leave a comment below about what has touched you the most so far. It could be an idea you once defended tooth and nail, a moment when changing your mind was difficult, or even something you still resist abandoning. This space is not for judgment, it's for shared reflection. When you comment, you're not just writing a text. You're helping other people realize they're not alone in these internal contradictions. Sometimes, reading about someone else's experience is the push needed to see your own brain workings more clearly. And that creates something powerful. A real sense of community, of exchange, of humanity. If this video is making you think differently, liking it now is a simple way to show that this type of content matters. This small gesture helps the video reach more people who also experience these silent conflicts between what they believe and what they discover later. That's how this message continues to spread. And if you feel you enjoy exploring the mysteries of the human brain, the mind, and those strange phenomena that influence our decisions without us realizing it, subscribing to the channel is almost like saying, I want to continue this journey. Because what's coming next delves even deeper into these invisible layers of human behavior. Here, each comment, each like, and each subscription isn't just cold numbers. They are signs that it's worthwhile to continue opening these conversations, addressing these uncomfortable points, and shedding light on mechanisms that operate in the silence of the mind. And now that you've realized how resistant the brain can be to change, stay with me because because this will make you see your own certainties in a completely different way. Think of something simple, almost automatic. One of those facts you've heard so many times throughout your life that you never felt the need to question it. Something said by parents, teachers, colleagues, television experts, or repeated so many times that it became part of common sense. It could be a belief about health, about how the human body works, about behavior, success, emotions, or even about how people really are. At some point, studies, data, and clear explanations emerge showing that it's not exactly true. The information has been revised. The idea has been debunked. The evidence is there, accessible, organized, consistent. And yet, many people continue to believe it in exactly the same way with the same conviction as before. Perhaps you've experienced this firsthand. A casual conversation that turns into a debate. A social media comment that generates intense reactions. A family argument where, even in the face of clear evidence, the person not only maintains their old belief but seems to defend it even more forcefully. Phrases like, that's always been the case, everyone knows that, that's obvious, emerge almost reflexively. There seems to be no room for doubt. There seems to be no curiosity. Something shuts down. From the outside, this is often interpreted as stubbornness, ignorance, or lack of information. But when we look more closely at the inner workings of the brain, what's happening is much more complex. When an old belief is questioned, it's not just an isolated idea that's being threatened. It's an entire internal structure. That idea has already been incorporated into how the person understands the world, makes decisions, makes choices, and constructs their own life narrative. Popular myths survive precisely for this reason. They don't survive because they are true but because they are familiar. They are simple. They sound coherent. They give a sense of order. An idea repeated over years takes deep root. It shapes mentality, influences decisions, guides daily behaviors without the person realizing it. When someone tries to remove this idea abruptly, the brain reacts as if it were being attacked. And attack generates defense. Defense generates resistance. The most curious thing is that often the person understands the new explanation on a rational level. They listen, follow the reasoning, and recognize that the arguments make sense. But inside something doesn't fit. A discomfort arises that is difficult to explain. A strange feeling that this new information doesn't belong there. This happens because the brain doesn't update beliefs like a computer updates a program. It doesn't erase an old version and install another in its place. It builds layers, associates emotions, creates internal stories that give meaning to its own journey. When an old belief crumbles, the brain needs to reorganize part of that history. It needs to review past decisions, old interpretations, choices that seemed obvious at the time. This requires cognitive effort. It requires mental energy. It requires tolerance for uncertainty. And, above all, it requires accepting that, for a long time, something considered true wasn't quite so. For the brain, this is not trivial. It's uncomfortable. It's unstable. It's threatening. Therefore, instead of discarding the old idea, the brain often does the opposite. It reinforces it. It looks for exceptions, minimizes contrary evidence, and questions the source of new information. All of this happens almost automatically. Not because the person wants to deceive anyone, but because the brain is trying to preserve internal consistency. One of the hidden truths of human behavior is this. Often we defend ideas not because they are true, but because they support the image we have of ourselves. This mechanism appears all the time in everyday life. In beliefs about food, productivity, emotions, relationships, career, success, and failure. Ideas that have already been extensively revised continue to circulate with impressive force. And the longer a belief has existed without being questioned, the greater the resistance to change tends to be. It's not a coincidence. It's structural. There is also a silent emotional factor in this process. Admitting that an old idea was wrong can generate shame, guilt, or a feeling of loss of control. It can give the impression that important decisions were made based on something flawed. The brain interprets this as risk. And once again it goes into protection mode. It prefers to maintain a known explanation rather than face the emotional impact of abandoning it. This profoundly influences decisions, shaping attitudes, choices, and judgments, often without the person realizing it. When we look at this more clearly, it becomes easier to understand why debates rarely change opinions, why facts alone almost never convince, why showing evidence doesn't guarantee transformation. Real change usually begins in a less visible place, the internal willingness to question one's own narrative. Without this, new information finds no space. It bounces off, slips away, and goes on its way. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because this attachment doesn't arise by chance. It follows clear, predictable patterns, almost invisible in everyday life. There are specific mechanisms that make the brain value the first version of an idea, even when it has already been disproven. Understanding these mechanisms completely changes how you view your certainties, your mindset, your decisions, and the silent impact all of this has on your personal journey. Before we continue, leave a comment below. That makes sense to me. There is a silent mechanism at work all the time behind the scenes of the mind that helps explain why old ideas seem so difficult to abandon, even when they have been clearly disproven. It's a simple mechanism to understand, but profoundly powerful in the impact it exerts throughout life. The brain assigns exaggerated value to the first piece of information it learns about any subject. What arrives first doesn't enter as just another piece of data among others. It enters as a central reference, as a basis, as a mental foundation. When an idea takes root early in the mind, it begins to function as an invisible starting point. Everything that comes after is compared to it, not consciously, logically, or deliberately, but automatically. The brain begins to use this first version as a yardstick to measure what seems true, reliable, or acceptable. This is how a sense of internal stability is built. And the brain is extremely attached to this stability. He thinks of it like building a house. The first piece of information is the foundation. It's the structure that supports everything else. Over time, walls are erected, stories are built, furniture is placed, adaptations are made. The house grows, becoming more complex, more inhabited. Now imagine someone saying that the problem is down there, in the foundation. That the foundation wasn't well calculated. The brain doesn't react like a curious engineer. It reacts like someone who has lived in that house for years. Because tampering with the foundations means dismantling a lot of things. It means dealing with instability, risk, uncertainty. And the brain avoids that whenever it can. This illusion of the first truth creates a powerful sense of solidity. The old idea seems firm, reliable, secure, not because it is correct but because it was the first. The earlier it entered, the more deeply it blended into identity, into decisions made throughout life, into how the person explains the world to themselves. Questioning this idea is not just revising an isolated concept. It is tampering with an invisible foundation that underpins many other beliefs, choices, and interpretations. Therefore, when new information emerges, even if it is more accurate, up-to-date, or supported by solid evidence, the brain does not evaluate it on equal terms. It compares it to what was already there. And if the new information conflicts with the old foundation, it generates strangeness. It seems uncomfortable. It seems suspicious. Not because it is wrong, but because it threatens the continuity of the internal structure that has already been built. This process profoundly and constantly influences decisions, from simple everyday choices to important stances on health, career, relationships, values, and worldview. Our mindset is shaped around these initial truths, and the brain begins to defend them as if defending its own integrity. Herein lies an uncomfortable revelation. Often we are not defending facts, but rather the story we tell ourselves about who we are and how we got here. The brain prefers a coherent narrative to a precise one. It seeks continuity more than accuracy. This helps explain why old ideas continue to make sense, even when they no longer hold up. They fit better into the internal story built up over time. Changing this narrative requires transformation. It requires letting go of certainties that have offered comfort for a long time. It requires accepting that some decisions were made based on flawed premises. For the brain, this has a real emotional impact. Behind the scenes of the mind, the first truth acts as an invisible filter. It defines what seems logical, plausible, or absurd even before any conscious analysis. New information passes through this emotional and cognitive filter. If it doesn't fit, it is rejected, distorted, or minimized. This doesn't happen out of bad faith or ignorance. It happens because the brain is programmed to preserve internal coherence, even if it costs accuracy. It's important to understand that this attachment isn't a character flaw. It's an adaptive strategy. At some point in our evolution, trusting the first available information helped us make quick decisions, reduce uncertainty, and increase our chances of survival. The problem arises when this same mechanism begins to block necessary updates. When the old foundation prevents important reforms. When the search for stability clashes with a changed reality. This conflict often manifests as a diffuse feeling of discomfort. Something seems out of place but the person doesn't know exactly what. The hidden truth is that, often, the brain perceives before consciousness that an old idea no longer holds up. But abandoning it requires going through a period of doubt, revision, and vulnerability. And not everyone is ready for that at the same pace. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because understanding the weight of the first truth opens the way to something even more delicate. How emotional comfort keeps beliefs alive and how this shapes choices, behaviors, and the silent impact these ideas exert throughout our journey. Write it in the comments. I'm on this journey too. There is a profound reason why old ideas survive even when they no longer make rational sense, and it is not linked to logic, intelligence, or access to information. It is linked to the emotional comfort of being right. Because over time, ideas cease to be just loose thoughts. They transform into something much bigger. They come to occupy a place within a person's identity. They become part of how they define themselves, position themselves in the world, and make decisions. When someone says, "I believe in this," what is often implied is, "This is part of who I am." That idea may have guided important choices, influenced relationships, shaped attitudes, and underpinned difficult decisions. Questioning it is not just revising an intellectual concept. It is touching on something intimate. It is putting a personal narrative built over years to the test. And the brain perceives this as a threat. Therefore, the discomfort that arises when an old belief is questioned is not insignificant. It can manifest as irritation, defensiveness, sarcasm, denial, or even contempt for the new information. In some cases, shame arises. The silent feeling of, "How did I not see this before?" In others, fear arises. Fear of appearing inconsistent, weak, naive, or contradictory. The brain reacts by trying to avoid this emotional impact at all costs. In the depths of the mind, abandoning an old idea can feel like a loss. A loss of identity. A loss of security. A loss of control. The old belief functioned as a fixed point in an unstable world. It provided predictability. It gave a sense of mastery. Letting go of that means entering uncharted territory. And the human brain doesn't like the unknown. It prefers the familiar, even when the familiar no longer corresponds to reality. This is where something disconcerting happens. The brain begins to confuse being right with being safe. The emotional feeling of security starts to be interpreted as proof of truth. If an idea makes me feel stable, confident, belonging to a group, or consistent with my history, it seems correct. A new idea, even if true, can generate anxiety, doubt, and a feeling of disconnection. And the brain makes a silent choice. Sometimes the brain prefers to be wrong, than uncomfortable. This preference isn't conscious. No one wakes up thinking, "I'm going to hold on to a false belief today." What happens is more subtle. The brain selects which information to accept and which to reject based on the emotional impact it has. If something threatens identity, it creates resistance. If something reinforces the image a person has of themselves, it readily accepts it. This explains why certain ideas seem immune to facts. Because they are not being defended in the realm of reason, but in the emotional realm. They are beliefs that offer belonging, a sense of value, internal coherence. Giving them up would require going through uncomfortable and often lonely emotions. And the brain, like a good survival strategist, tries to avoid that. The impact of this on decisions is enormous. A person may maintain harmful habits, limiting choices, or distorted views of reality simply because these ideas underpin a known identity. They maintain a stable narrative, "I am like this, the world works this way, things have always been this way." Questioning this can generate a temporary feeling of emptiness, as if something is missing. This void is frightening for the brain. It interprets it as a loss of reference point. And faced with this, it does what it knows best. It reinforces what already exists. The more a belief is attacked, the more central it can become to a person's identity. That's why some ideas become banners. They cease to be mere beliefs and become symbols of who the person is. There is also an important social factor in this emotional comfort. Many beliefs are shared within groups: family, friends, communities, professional environments. Abandoning an idea can mean distancing oneself from a group, questioning bonds, feeling different. The human brain is profoundly social. It values belonging. And, again, it prefers the security of being aligned with a group to the instability of thinking differently. All of this happens without the person clearly realizing it. The mind creates rational justifications afterward. but the decision has already been made on another level. An emotional, automatic, invisible level. This is one of the most difficult hidden truths to accept. Many of our convictions are not held because they are true, but because they are comfortable. And here lies a sensitive point in the journey of transformation. Questioning old beliefs is not a purely intellectual process. It's emotional. It's about identity. It requires inner maturity, tolerance for discomfort, and a willingness to reconstruct parts of one's own narrative. It's not something that happens overnight. It's a gradual process, full of resistance, advances, and setbacks. The brain is not the enemy in this process. It's trying to protect the person from emotional pain. But, in doing so, it can end up hindering growth, learning, and evolution. It holds the person back in old versions of themselves, even when new possibilities are already available. And this has a direct impact on mindset, choices, and how the person navigates their own journey. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because understanding this emotional attachment to ideas reveals something even more unsettling: how the brain constructs explanations to protect itself from discomfort, and how these explanations shape our perception of reality without us even realizing it. Before continuing, write in the comments, "That makes sense to me." There's a crucial point in this story that completely changes how we understand human behavior. The brain doesn't function like an impartial judge, sitting before the evidence, listening to all sides and making a fair decision based solely on the facts. That's a comfortable but unrealistic image. The brain functions much more like an experienced lawyer, and not just any lawyer but a defense attorney. Its mission isn't to discover the truth. Its mission is to protect the internal coherence of the narrative that has already been constructed. When an idea is questioned, the brain doesn't react by asking, "Is this true?" The real, silent question is, "Does this threaten the story I tell myself?" If the answer is yes, the brain springs into action. It begins to work actively to preserve the existing structure. And it does so in a sophisticated, fast, and often invisible way to consciousness. It is at this moment that something fascinating to observe emerges. Instead of weighing arguments in a balanced way, the brain begins to select information. It highlights everything that confirms the old belief and minimizes, distorts, or ignores what contradicts it. It's not a miscalculation. It's a strategy. Internal coherence matters more than external accuracy. Keeping the story standing is more urgent than revising it. Behind the scenes of the mind, this happens all the time. An old idea is disproven, but the brain quickly finds exceptions. That might even be true in some cases, but it's different for me. That study doesn't consider such a thing. That works in theory but not in practice. Each of these phrases seems rational, balanced, sensible. But, in reality, they serve a clear emotional function: protecting the original belief. The brain is extremely creative when it takes on the role of lawyer. It constructs alternative explanations, raises selective doubts, questions specific sources, and strengthens convenient arguments. And all this happens without the person realizing they have already chosen a side before even analyzing the evidence. The decision doesn't come after the analysis. The analysis comes after the decision. This mechanism has a profound impact on how we perceive reality, because it creates the illusion that we are being rational, when in fact we are being consistent with our internal history. The truth becomes filtered through the already existing mindset. It doesn't enter as something new but as something that needs to fit. If it doesn't fit, it is rejected. This is one of the most uncomfortable revelations about the human brain. The search is not for objective truth, but for the maintenance of identity. A disproven idea is not just an incorrect piece of information. It represents a crack in the personal narrative. And the brain does everything to plug that crack quickly before it spreads. This explains why heated debates rarely change opinions. Because, while one side presents data, the other side is busy defending consistency. They are different games happening simultaneously. One is talking about facts. The other is protecting an internal structure. And internal structures don't give way easily. The impact of this on decisions is enormous. From simple choices to profound stances on values, politics, health, career, and relationships. The brain constructs a line of reasoning that seems logical, but which actually serves to justify decisions already made emotionally. Rationalization comes later. Always later. There's a hidden truth here that often bothers people. The more intelligent a person is, the more sophisticated their internal defense tends to be. A brain trained in argumentation, logic, and language doesn't necessarily get closer to the truth. Often, it simply becomes more skilled at defending it when it's wrong. It creates more elaborate, more convincing, and harder to dismantle justifications. This isn't an individual flaw. It's a human pattern. The The brain evolved to maintain stability, not to constantly revise beliefs. Revising everything all the time would be too costly. So it creates shortcuts. And one of those shortcuts is defending what's already integrated into one's personal narrative. When an idea is disproven, accepting it requires more than just intellectual agreement. It requires reorganizing past decisions, revising judgments, and adjusting one's own self-image. This has a real emotional impact. The brain perceives this as a risk. And faced with risk, it prefers to defend rather than investigate. This lawyer-like stance creates a sense of security. The person feels they know where they stand, that their choices make sense, that their story remains coherent. Even if, on the outside, reality has already changed. Even if new information is available. Internal coherence functions as a psychological shelter. But this shelter comes at a cost. It can limit growth, learning, and transformation. It can keep a person trapped in old versions of themselves. It can influence important decisions without them realizing it. The brain protects, but it also imprisons. That's why changing your mind is one of the most difficult processes there is. Not because there's a lack of information, but because there's too much identity involved. Changing your mind requires the brain to temporarily relinquish its role as advocate and accept a state of uncertainty. And that goes against everything it's been trained to do. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because understanding the brain as a lawyer reveals something even more subtle. How it creates seemingly logical explanations to protect old beliefs and how this shapes our perception of reality, influencing every step of our journey without us even realizing it. Write your thoughts in the comments. That makes sense to me. There is another silent, almost hypnotic mechanism that keeps old ideas alive even after they have been disproven: repetition. The human brain is deeply sensitive to what is repeated. Not because repetition brings new evidence, but because it creates familiarity. And familiarity generates comfort. Comfort generates acceptance. Little by little, without the person realizing it, what is merely known begins to seem true. When an idea is heard many times in different contexts by different people, the brain registers something important. This isn't strange. And, for the brain, ceasing to be strange is already halfway to ceasing to be questioned. The idea doesn't need to be correct. It just needs to be recognizable. It only needs to sound familiar to overcome critical defenses more easily. Think about how many beliefs you've heard repeated since childhood. Phrases spoken as absolute truths, repeated at school, at home, at work, in the media. Over time, these ideas no longer require verification. They seem obvious. They seem part of the backdrop of reality. Even when studies, data, or explanations emerge showing that it doesn't hold up, the inner feeling remains, it's always been this way. This feeling doesn't come from logic. It comes from repetition. Each time an idea is reactivated, the brain processes it with less effort. It flows through the mind easily. And this fluidity is interpreted as a sign of truth. The brain thinks, if it's easy to process, it must be reliable. This is a powerful cognitive shortcut, built up over evolution to save mental energy. In the inner workings of the mind, repetition creates pathways. The more a pathway is used, the more defined it becomes. Thoughts follow it almost automatically. New ideas, which try to compete with these old pathways, seem more difficult, heavier, more tiring. Not because they are wrong, but because they require effort. And the brain prefers the known path. This is how refuted ideas continue to seem true. Not because they have withstood rigorous testing, but because they have survived the test of time. They have been repeated so many times that they have gained emotional status. They have become part of the mental landscape. And questioning something that is part of the landscape is uncomfortable. It seems unnecessary. It seems like an exaggeration. This effect profoundly influences decisions. A person may reject correct information simply because it sounds strange, while accepting a false idea because it sounds familiar. Mindset is shaped not by the quality of the evidence, but by the frequency of contact. This has a direct impact on how we choose, judge, and interpret the world. There's a hidden truth here that often goes unnoticed. The brain wasn't made to detect absolute truth. It was made to navigate complex environments using shortcuts. And repetition is one of the strongest shortcuts. If something appears many times, the brain assumes there's a reason. That it must be relevant. That it must be reliable. Even when it isn't. This mechanism explains why rumors, myths, and misconceptions spread so easily. Each repetition reinforces the feeling of legitimacy. Each new exposure strengthens the impression that it is normal. The mind stops asking, "Is this true?" and starts asking only, "Does this fit with what I already know?" If the answer is yes, the idea takes hold. Over time, familiarity creates an emotional layer. The idea begins to generate less internal resistance. It doesn't trigger alarms. It doesn't spark curiosity. It's simply there. And everything that has always been there seems difficult to question. Even when revelations emerge that completely dismantle that belief, the brain hesitates. Because abandoning something familiar requires traversing a space of estrangement. This feeling of strangeness is interpreted as risk. The brain thinks, if this sounds wrong to me, maybe it's dangerous. And then it reverts to the familiar, to the repeated, to the comfortable. This dynamic happens silently, automatically, without conscious debate. The person feels only a vague resistance, a distrust that is difficult to explain. This is where one of the most important phrases for understanding how the mind works emerges. The brain confuses familiarity with truth. What is repeated seems right. What is new seems suspicious. Not because one is true and the other false, but because one is known and the other is not. This pattern shapes entire journeys. It influences career choices, beliefs about oneself, worldviews, and personal boundaries. A repeated idea like, "This is who I am," can define decisions for decades. Even when new experiences show otherwise, the repetition of the internal discourse keeps the belief alive. Transformation requires interrupting this automatic repetition and creating space for new narratives. But this doesn't happen easily. The brain likes predictability. It likes to know what to expect. Repetition offers that. It creates a sense of control. Even if that control is illusory. Even if it's based on flawed premises. The mind prefers a stable illusion to a truth that demands adaptation. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because understanding the power of repetition opens the way to something even more intriguing. How the brain reacts when someone tries to correct an old belief and why often this attempt produces exactly the opposite effect to what was expected. Before continuing, write in the comments, "That makes sense to me." When you put all this together, it starts to become clear why correcting someone almost never works the way logic suggests. In theory, it seems simple. Present facts, show data, explain calmly, dismantle an old belief point by point. But in practice, the effect is usually the opposite. The person shuts down, hardens. They defend their idea with even more conviction. And this doesn't happen because they are incapable of understanding, nor because they lack intelligence or information. It happens because, for the brain, direct correction rarely sounds like help. It sounds like a threat. When someone feels their beliefs are being challenged, the brain doesn't just listen to the content of what's being said. It listens to the emotional impact of the situation. It assesses the context. It tries to answer a silent question, "What does this say about me?" Often, the message that comes across isn't "they're bringing a new perspective," but rather "they're saying I'm wrong, they're questioning my ability, they're diminishing something that's part of who I am." Even when this isn't true, the brain reacts as if it were. When this perception arises, the brain automatically goes into defensive mode. It's not a conscious choice. It's not deliberate pride. It's protection. The priority ceases to be a better understanding of reality and becomes preserving one's own emotional integrity. The more direct, insistent, or confrontational the correction, the stronger this reaction tends to be. The brain doesn't open up when it feels attacked. It contracts. That's why phrases like, "That's already been proven wrong, how can you still believe that?" or "The facts show otherwise," almost never generate real change. They activate emotions like shame, anger, irritation, or humiliation. And these emotions are terrible allies of learning. They close internal doors. The mind stops listening and starts defending itself. Behind the scenes in the brain, something very specific happens at this moment. The correction is interpreted as a social risk. The brain senses that it may lose status, respect, or belonging. For a deeply social brain, this is serious. The threat is not just intellectual, it's relational. In response, it reinforces the old belief as a form of self-protection. The more the idea is attacked, the more it becomes a shield. This helps explain why so many discussions end with people even more convinced than before. Not because the opposing arguments were weak, but because the confrontation activated the wrong mechanism. Instead of curiosity, it activated defense. Instead of openness, it activated closure. The brain doesn't revise deep-seated beliefs when it feels under attack. It entrenches itself. There is also a subtle but very important factor. When someone corrects another person, even with good intentions, they generally assume an implicit position of superiority. One knows, the other doesn't. One teaches, the other learns. To the brain of the person being corrected, this can feel like a loss of value. And nobody likes to feel diminished. The brain reacts by trying to restore balance, reaffirming its position even more forcefully. All of this happens quickly, almost invisibly. The person may even continue listening, nodding, appearing to agree. But internally the channel has already closed. The brain begins to look for flaws in the other person's discourse, not to learn but to defend itself. Every piece of information presented becomes a target. Every explanation becomes something to be contested. The conversation ceases to be about truth and becomes about psychological territory. Therefore, changing beliefs rarely happens in direct debates. True transformation usually arises in contexts of emotional safety, in spaces where there is no explicit or implicit judgment, where making mistakes doesn't mean losing value, where changing your mind isn't seen as weakness but as maturity. The brain only allows itself to question something profound when it doesn't feel threatened. This doesn't mean that people don't want to learn or evolve. It means that the brain needs to feel that change is safe, that it doesn't jeopardize identity, belonging, or dignity. Without this, any attempt at correction becomes automatic resistance. The mind shuts down as a self-preservation mechanism. When we understand this process, something important happens. Empathy is born. Empathy for those who resist. Empathy for those who cling to old ideas even in the face of new information. Most of the time it's not ill will. It's fear. It's protection. It's the brain trying to maintain stability amidst a perceived threat. Judging this behavior only reinforces the cycle. Understanding creates space. This understanding also changes how we look at ourselves. How many times have you caught yourself reacting badly to a correction? How many times have you felt irritation even when, deep down, something made sense? How many decisions have you defended more out of a need to be right than out of a search for truth? This says nothing about your character. It says a lot about how the human brain works. The impact of this on one's personal journey is profound. If the brain shuts down in the face of correction, it also shuts down in the face of opportunities for growth. New perspectives don't enter. Revelations go unnoticed. The mindset becomes rigid. Not because the person doesn't want to evolve, but because the internal environment doesn't seem safe for it. Transformation requires openness. And openness requires emotional protection. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because understanding why direct correction almost never works leads us to something even more delicate. What really makes the brain lower its guard, feel safe, and finally allow an old belief to be questioned without resistance. Before continuing, write in the comments, "That makes sense to me." There is a rare, silent, and profoundly human moment when the brain finally begins to release an old idea. It's not a dramatic snap. It's not a sudden shift. It doesn't happen because someone won a debate or presented the perfect argument. Real change almost never arises from confrontation. It arises from time, from emotional security, from the curiosity that emerges when the mind no longer feels threatened. When the brain realizes it can question a belief without losing value, something changes inside. It begins to lower its guard. Not completely, but enough to allow small cracks in the old narrative. And it is in these cracks that the transformation begins. First comes a slight doubt, almost imperceptible. Then a question that didn't exist before. Next, a timid openness to consider another possibility. None of this is conscious at the beginning. It's a gradual, organic, deeply internal process. The brain only releases an idea when it senses it won't be punished for it. Punished emotionally, socially, or in terms of identity. It needs to feel that abandoning a belief doesn't mean losing who it is, doesn't mean being rejected, doesn't mean erasing its entire history. As long as change seems like a threat to identity or belonging, resistance remains. But when the mind realizes it can change and still remain whole, something unlocks. This realization often arises in safe environments. Conversations without judgment. Personal experiences that no longer fit into old beliefs. Moments of silence in which the person reflects alone, without needing to defend themselves from anyone. Curiosity begins to replace defense. And this is crucial. Because curiosity doesn't demand certainty. It allows exploration. It allows doubt. It allows revision. Behind the scenes in the brain, this process is delicate. It needs time to reorganize connections, review emotional associations, and reconstruct internal narratives. The old belief doesn't disappear all at once. It loses strength gradually. It is replaced not by another rigid certainty, but by a more flexible understanding. The brain begins to tolerate the idea that it may have been wrong without it defining it negatively. This is a fundamental point. The brain only changes when it realizes that making mistakes doesn't equate to losing value. When abandoning an idea doesn't mean failure, but maturity. When change is seen as a natural part of the journey and not as a defeat. This completely changes the emotional impact of the process. Resistance decreases. The mind relaxes. Openness grows. Often this change begins with small decisions. A different choice here. An adjusted behavior there. An exception to the old rule. The brain tests the new perspective in small doses. It observes the consequences. It assesses whether it is safe. Whether there is no punishment. Whether the world will fall apart. And little by little, the new idea gains ground. Not because it was imposed, but because it proved viable. There is something profoundly hopeful in this, because it shows that the brain is not an enemy of change. It is cautious. It protects. But when it feels safe, it adapts. It learns. It evolves. Transformation doesn't happen despite the brain, but with it. When the right conditions are present, the human mind is incredibly flexible. This flexibility has a direct impact on mindset. People who can let go of old ideas without feeling threatened develop a different relationship with their own history. They understand that past decisions were made with the information available at that time. That changing their mind doesn't invalidate who they were, it only updates who they are. This creates a healthy sense of continuity instead of rupture. Belonging is also crucial in this process. When a person realizes that they will still be accepted, respected, and valued even when changing positions, the brain relaxes even more. The need for defense decreases. Openness increases. This is why welcoming environments produce more learning than competitive environments. The mind learns better when it feels safe. Throughout this journey, something interesting happens. The person begins to recognize old patterns in themselves. You start to notice other beliefs that perhaps also deserve revision. Not with haste, not with guilt, but with curiosity. The brain learns that change is not dangerous. And this creates a positive cycle of growth. The mindset becomes more flexible. Decisions become more conscious. The relationship with truth deepens. This is one of the great revelations about human behavior. Change doesn't happen when someone proves us wrong. It happens when we feel safe enough to question on our own. When the mind stops fighting to protect itself and begins to explore in order to understand. This is not weakness. It is cognitive maturity. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because understanding how the brain releases an idea leads us to something even more subtle. The exact moment when doubt ceases to be a threat and becomes an invitation. That's when real transformations begin to happen, almost silently, but with a lasting impact on how we think, decide, and navigate our own journey. Write it in the comments. I'm on this journey too. After going through all of that, it's almost inevitable that something will start to stir inside, not as a clear, organized, or immediate response, but as a feeling that's hard to name. A small internal shift. A different kind of silence. Because when we understand how these mechanisms work, it becomes impossible to keep looking only outward. Pointing out other people's beliefs, their mistakes, resistances that seem obvious to those who are distant is always more comfortable. The real impact begins when the mirror turns back on us. Throughout life, we all build ideas that have sustained us at certain times. They gave us grounding when uncertainty was lacking, helped us through difficult phases, justified important decisions, and offered a sense of control amidst confusion. Many of these ideas were useful. Some were necessary. Others simply remained. Not because they continued to be true, but because they continued to offer emotional comfort. And the brain, as has become clear, deeply values this comfort. There is something very human about clinging to what is known. The known requires no extra effort. It requires no revision. It requires no internal reconstruction. It fits perfectly into the narrative we tell ourselves about who we are, about how the world works, about what to expect from people and from life. Questioning this is not a purely intellectual exercise. It is an emotional movement. It is existential. It is stirring deep layers that go far beyond information. When an old idea persists, it doesn't remain stagnant. It continues to act. It continues to influence small and large decisions. It guides automatic reactions, quick judgments, and unspoken expectations. It shapes mindset without asking permission. Often, we only realize this impact when something no longer fits. When reality responds differently than expected. When repeated experiences conflict with what we have always believed. This internal conflict is often uncomfortable. The brain doesn't like it. It prefers to deflect, justify, rationalize, find exceptions. All to avoid friction. But this doesn't always work. At times, doubt persists. A question returns. Not as an accusation but as an invitation. A silent invitation to look more closely. That's where a different kind of journey begins. A journey less about proving who is right and more about understanding what still makes sense to uphold. True transformation rarely happens dramatically or noisily. It happens in silence. In the moments when you realize you're defending something without knowing exactly why. In the moments when an old belief begins to demand more energy to maintain than to question. When the brain, little by little, begins to realize that the emotional cost of sustaining that idea may be greater than the discomfort of revising it. This is a delicate point, because admitting that an idea was maintained for emotional convenience shakes the image we have of ourselves. We like to see ourselves as rational people, guided by facts, arguments, and logic. Recognizing the role of emotional comfort requires humility, but it also offers something powerful: freedom. Freedom to update one's own narrative without having to erase the past. Looking inward doesn't mean blaming yourself. It means understanding. Understanding that, at many moments, you did the best you could with the information, experiences, and emotional resources you had at that point in your journey. That past decisions don't need to be invalidated for future decisions to be more conscious. The brain needs this bridge. It needs to feel continuity to allow for change without internal collapse. There is a hidden truth in all of this. Questioning a comfortable idea is not an act of weakness. It is a sign of psychological maturity. It is recognizing that the mind is alive, in motion, in constant adjustment. That the human journey is not about arriving at a definitive set of certainties, but about maintaining the capacity for revision when reality demands updating. When you start asking yourself honest questions without rushing to answer, something changes. Defenses lessen. Rigidity loosens. Curiosity begins to occupy the space that was previously dominated by the fear of being wrong. It's not about abandoning everything you believe in. It's about consciously choosing what still deserves to be carried with you. What still contributes. What is still aligned with who you are becoming. This process also changes how you see others. The rigidity of others begins to seem less like arrogance and more like protectiveness. Resistance ceases to be mere stubbornness and begins to be understood as a fear of losing ground. This doesn't mean agreeing with everything, but it generates empathy. And empathy is fertile ground for real dialogue, including with yourself. There are ideas that worked at a specific stage of life, but that no longer reflect who you are today. There are beliefs that helped you survive but no longer help you grow. Recognizing this doesn't erase the value they had. It simply acknowledges that cycles come to an end. And when the brain understands that ending a cycle doesn't mean losing identity or belonging, it begins to let go. At this point in the journey, the question ceases to be, "Is this true?" and becomes, "Does this still serve me?" This change is profound because it shifts the focus from defense to awareness, from the need to be right to the need to be aligned. And this transforms the relationship with decisions, with choices, and with one's own history. Perhaps the hardest part is accepting that some ideas persist not out of conviction, but out of emotional habit. They occupy space because they've always been there. Because they offer a sense of predictability. Because they avoid the discomfort of uncertainty. But, little by little, the brain can learn that uncertainty is not the enemy. That it can be a portal. A space of possibilities. An invitation to expansion. This type of reflection doesn't demand immediate answers. It doesn't ask for quick conclusions. It demands presence. Observation. Inner honesty. Because when you allow yourself to look inward without judgment, the brain begins to relax. And when it relaxes, it opens space for something new to emerge. Not imposed, not forced, but integrated. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, but first let this question resonate within you without haste, without needing a ready answer. What idea do you still defend, not because it's true but because it's comfortable? If you like, write a simple sentence in the comments, "That makes sense to me." If you've made it this far, it's because something along the way resonated with you. Perhaps a phrase, an idea, or simply the feeling of putting into words something you already felt but had never stopped to observe calmly. This kind of reflection isn't common, and it only happens when we allow ourselves to go a little deeper, together. If this content has helped you see your own beliefs more clearly, subscribing to the channel is a simple way to continue this journey. The idea here is exactly that, to explore the inner workings of the mind, question what seems obvious, and bring reflections that truly impact how we think, decide, and live. Also leave a comment saying that you made it to the end. You could write something like, "This message was for me," or, "I'm with you until the end." I do read genuinely, and that helps keep this space alive with people who are willing to look inward and have honest conversations. If you felt a connection to what was said while watching the video, a like here is just a way to signal that. It helps the content reach more people who might be at that same point of questioning. There's a video over here that complements everything we've discussed today. If it makes sense to you, click on it and continue watching.